The Fear Factory Stories.
Working the night shift is usually quiet. Too quiet sometimes. But that night, when the door slammed open and I saw the man's eyes, I knew this wasn't going to end well. I've been working the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, for about a year now. The place sits on a lonely stretch of highway, far enough away from the city that we don't get much traffic during the late hours. It's a quiet job. Most of the time I just sit behind the counter, ring up the occasional customer, and watch the clock slowly crawl toward morning. The night this all happened was no different from any other. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was getting ready for the end of my shift. The store was empty, as it usually is at that time. The lights outside cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning inside the store. I had been counting the cash from the register, making sure everything was in order. My manager always told me to be careful, especially at night. You never know who might come through that door, she would say. I didn't think much of it then. I thought I had everything under control. I had just finished counting the last of the bills when the front door suddenly slammed open. The sound was so loud I nearly jumped out of my seat. Before I could even register what was happening, a man stormed inside. He looked rough. Dirty clothes, wild eyes, and he smelled like he hadn't showered in days. He didn't say anything. His eyes were locked on the cash I was holding in my hand. For a second, my body froze, and everything seemed to slow down. I knew I should have done something, but I just stood there. Without warning, he lunged at me, grabbing the cash from my hands. It all happened so fast. 1 second I had the money in my hands, the next it was gone, and the man was already halfway to the door. That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I don't know what came over me, but I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I bolted from behind the counter and ran after him, shouting for him to stop. The adrenaline pumping through my veins drowned out any fear I might have felt. The guy wasn't moving too fast. He stumbled as he reached the parking lot, his movements unsteady. I figured he had to be on something. Drugs, maybe. I could see the money sticking out of his jacket pocket as he tried to make his escape. "Stop right there," I yelled. He turned around, panic in his eyes. He tried to run faster, but his body wasn't cooperating. I closed the gap between us, and without thinking, I grabbed him by the arm. He struggled, trying to shake me off, but I held on. We wrestled for a moment before he broke free and started running again, but he wasn't getting far. My heart was racing, but I wasn't about to give up. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. I told them where I was, describing the man and what had just happened. They told me officers were on their way. I kept following him, keeping a safe distance now. I didn't want to corner him. Who knows what a desperate man might do? He didn't seem to notice that I was still trailing him. He was more focused on running, though it was clear he wasn't going to get far. His pace was slowing, and he kept looking over his shoulder. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The man heard it too. He stopped dead in his tracks, his whole body tensing up. I stayed back, not wanting to spook him any further. Within moments, The police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. 2 officers got out, guns drawn, ordering the man to get on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was over. Slowly he dropped to his knees and put his hands behind his head. The officers moved in, cuffing him and pulling him to his feet. One of them came over to me asking me for details. I explained everything, still trying to catch my breath. My hands were trembling, but I tried to stay calm as I recounted what happened. They searched the man and found the cash still stuffed in his jacket. One of the officers told me that the man was homeless and likely on drugs, which explained his erratic behavior. He had probably been desperate, looking for anything he could get his hands on. I watched as they led him to the back of the squad car, his head hanging low. A part of me felt sorry for him, living on the streets, addicted to something that was ruining his life. But at the same time, I was relieved that the whole ordeal was over. The officers thanked me for my quick response, telling me I did the right thing by calling them. They said that chasing him wasn't the safest option, but they understood why I did it. I nodded, still shaken by the whole thing. After the police left, I went back inside the gas station. The place felt different now. What was once just another quiet night on the job had turned into something I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I sat behind the counter, trying to calm my nerves, my hands still feeling shaky. I looked at the clock. My shift was almost over, but I wasn't counting the minutes like I usually did. I just sat there, staring at the front door, half expecting someone else to burst through. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I came to something worse. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my things and left, locking the doors behind me. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but think about the man. Life had beaten him down, and in his desperation, he made a choice that landed him in the back of a police car. But as I drove home, I realized something. I was lucky. Things could have gone a lot worse that night. I never believed in ghosts until that night. I thought it was just another abandoned house, just another dare. But what we found inside still haunts me to this day. A few years ago, my best friend, Kevin, and I decided to explore an old abandoned house on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts. We had heard all sorts of stories about the place. Rumors that it was haunted, that people went in and never came out, that the spirits of those who had died there still roamed the halls. We didn't believe any of it, of course. We thought it would be fun, a little thrill on a boring weekend. The house sat on a hill, far from any other buildings, hidden by a dense thicket of trees. It looked ancient, with its cracked walls, broken windows, and a roof that had caved in at some spots. Vines climbed up its sides, making it look like it was being swallowed by nature. As we approached, I felt a cold, uneasy feeling settle in my chest. Kevin, always the brave one, walked ahead confidently. "We'll just go in, take a quick look around, and leave," Kevin said, trying to sound calm. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the strange sense of dread creeping over me. The air around the house felt colder, heavier, like something was watching us. We pushed through the mitrailleuse to the broken gate, and the front door hung off its hinges, creaking loudly as we opened it. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of dust and decay. The floor was covered in dirt, and old furniture lay scattered, broken, and forgotten. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint sounds of the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. Kevin began to wander around, examining the old furniture and peeling wallpaper, while I stayed close behind, my eyes darting to every corner. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The deeper we moved into the house, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. We reached a narrow staircase that led to the second floor. Kevin turned to me with a grin. "Let's check upstairs," he suggested. I hesitated. "Maybe we should just look around down here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But Kevin was already climbing the stairs, the old wood creaking under his weight. I sighed and reluctantly followed him, gripping the railing tightly. The second floor was even darker than the first. The windows were either boarded up or too dirty to let in any light. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed a foul smell, like something rotten. I wanted to tell Kevin that we should leave, but before I could say anything, we heard it. A low, deep growl echoing through the hallway. Kevin froze, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The sound was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't an animal growl. It was something much more sinister. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. But Kevin, stubborn as ever, started walking toward the door. "It's probably just the wind or something," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. As he reached for the door, the growling grew louder, more menacing. My heart was racing, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Kevin slowly pushed the door open, and what we saw inside made my stomach churn. The room was dark, but in the corner we could see a shadow, a figure that wasn't quite human. It was hunched over, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. The growling stopped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then the figure spoke, in a voice that made my skin crawl. "Leave, or never leave again." The words hung in the air like a curse. Kevin and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted down the hallway. The house seemed to come alive around us, the walls groaning, the floor creaking as if something was chasing us. We stumbled down the stairs, barely keeping our balance, and sprinted for the front door. The air around us felt thick, like it was trying to pull us back, but we didn't stop. We never spoke about that day again, but the memory of it stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come too close to something dangerous, something that didn't want us there. The words of the figure echoed in my mind. "Leave, or never leave again." To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house, but one thing is certain. We were lucky to escape. Not everyone might be as fortunate, and I never forgot the warning. Leave, or never leave again. One minute we were laughing and singing along to the radio. The next, I was staring at my own lifeless body. Was this a dream, or had we really crossed over to the other side? It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just me, my best friends, Chris, Megan, and Josh, heading out for a camping trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. We were all college friends, and after a brutal semester, we needed a break. The thought of sleeping under the stars, roasting marshmallows, and sharing ghost stories by the campfire sounded like the perfect escape. The drive up was filled with laughter and excitement. We were playing our favorite songs on the radio, singing along at the top of our lungs. But something about that night felt different. The trees seemed to loom closer to the road, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above, casting strange shadows that danced across the pavement. I tried to shake off the unease that settled in the pit of my stomach, convincing myself it was just the thrill of the trip. We were joking around, and everything seemed fine until we hit a sharp turn that came out of nowhere. Chris, who was driving, tried to swerve, but the road was slick from the rain earlier that day. The tires screeched, and the car skidded off the road, crashing into a tree. I heard Megan scream, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, we were all standing outside the car. It was crumpled against a massive oak tree, the front smashed in, steam rising from the engine. I felt strange, like everything was muffled and distant. Megan was standing next to me, her face pale, and Josh was on the other side, staring at the wreckage. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice sounding oddly flat. Megan nodded slowly, but she wouldn't look at me. Josh was silent, his eyes fixed on the car. I turned to see what he was staring at, and that's when my heart dropped. Inside the car, still strapped into our seats, were our bodies. I blinked, unable to process what I was seeing. There I was, slumped over in the passenger seat, a trickle of blood running down my forehead. Chris was still gripping the steering wheel, his face twisted in pain. Megan and Josh were in the back, their faces ashen. "We're outside the car," Megan whispered, finally looking at me, her eyes wide with fear. "But we are still in there." I didn't know what to think. It felt like a nightmare, but everything was so vivid, so real. I reached out to touch the car, but my hand passed right through the metal. Panic started to build in my chest. "Are we dead?" Josh finally spoke, his voice trembling. I didn't want to answer. The thought was too horrifying, too impossible. But what else could explain what was happening? We were standing there outside our bodies, unable to touch anything, unable to feel anything. The forest around us seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. It felt like we were being watched, like something was waiting for us in the shadows. "Are we dead?" Josh finally spoke, his voice trembling. I tried to move, to walk away from the car, but my feet felt heavy, as if something was pulling me back. "We have to get out of here," I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked. Maybe there's a way to fix this." But where could we go? We were in the middle of the woods, far from any town or help. The only thing that seemed real was the car and the broken bodies inside. Time passed in a blur. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at ourselves trapped in that sinking vehicle. The night seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch, made my heart race. It felt like the trees themselves were whispering, mocking us, telling us that we didn't belong in this world anymore. At some point, I started to feel dizzy, like I was being pulled into a deep, dark hole. My vision blurred, and the sounds around me faded. I could hear Megan crying and could see Josh's terrified face, but it all seemed far away. Then everything went black again. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. The bright lights above me stung my eyes, and the beeping of machines filled the room. I turned my head slowly, feeling groggy, like I was waking up from a long, terrible dream. Chris was in the bed next to me, his eyes half open, and I could see Megan and Josh in the room as well, all of us hooked up to monitors, bandages covering our wounds. "We're alive," I whispered, not quite believing it. A nurse came into the room, checking our vitals and smiling warmly. "You all had a nasty accident, but you're going to be okay," she said. "You've been unconscious for a couple of days, but you're out of danger now." I could hardly process her words. My mind was still reeling from what we had experienced. I looked at Megan, who was staring back at me with wide eyes. Josh was silent, his face pale, but there was relief in his expression. It had felt so real, the crash, our bodies trapped in that sinking car, the fear that we were ghosts. But now, lying in this hospital bed, I wasn't sure what to believe. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of shared nightmare brought on by the trauma of the crash? As the nurse continued to check on us, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It didn't feel like a nightmare, not entirely. The memory of that dark forest, the sinking feeling of being trapped outside my own body, lingered in my mind, too vivid to ignore. But as I looked at my friends, safe and alive, I tried to push the thoughts away. We were okay. We had survived. The nightmare was over. I had always trusted my dad. He was my guide, my protector. But that night in the woods, with every snap of a twig and every rustle of leaves, I realized there are things out there even he couldn't protect me from. It was the fall of 2024 when I was 14 years old. My dad decided it was time for another one of our annual hunting trips. This time, we were headed to the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. We had been there before, but this time, something felt different. The air was thicker, the trees seemed closer together, and there was an uneasy stillness that set my nerves on edge. It was darker than usual, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We arrived just before sunset, setting up camp near the edge of the forest. My dad always told me that the best time to hunt was at night, when the animals were more active. I wasn't scared. I'd been hunting with my dad many times before, and I trusted him completely. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the trees, a feeling of unease crept over me. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, twisting the forest into a maze of dark shapes. We walked deeper into the woods, our boots crunching softly on the leaves. My dad carried his rifle, and I held a smaller one he had given me for my birthday. I clutched it close to my chest, feeling the cool metal against my palms. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees grew, blocking out the moonlight. Soon the only light came from our flashlights. Now and then we would stop, listening for any sign of movement. My dad was good at tracking animals. He would often crouch down to inspect the ground, but that night, we didn't hear or see anything. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs. It was like the forest had gone completely still. After about an hour of walking, I started to feel tired. My legs ached, and I wanted to rest. My dad noticed and suggested we sit down for a bit. We found a small clearing and sat on a fallen log. The forest was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. My dad whispered something about waiting for the right moment, but I barely heard him. I was too focused on the darkness around us. Suddenly, there was a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the snapping of a twig. It was a low growl, deep and guttural, like something big was watching us. My heart sped up, and I looked at my dad. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. Slowly he reached for his rifle, motioning for me to do the same. The growl came again, this time closer. It echoed through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I gripped my rifle tighter, my hands shaking. My dad stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. He didn't say a word, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we had ever encountered before. My dad whispered for me to stay still, but my legs felt like they were going to give out. I didn't move, frozen in place as the creature slowly stepped closer. Its growl turned into a snarl, its yellow eyes locked on us. My dad raised his rifle, aiming at the creature, but he didn't shoot. It was like we both knew that shooting wouldn't help us. The creature circled us, moving through the shadows. Every time I thought it was gone, it would appear again, its glowing eyes watching us from the darkness. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear. We were trapped, surrounded by darkness and this terrifying creature. Then it let out a loud, bone-chilling howl, so loud that it seemed to shake the trees around us. My dad grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. Without thinking, I ran. I could hear my dad running behind me, and the creature's growls echoed through the forest. The trees blurred as we sprinted through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and face. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to collapse, but I didn't stop. We ran deeper into the forest, not caring which direction we were going. All I knew was that I had to get away from that creature. But the more we ran, the more lost we became. The familiar trails had disappeared, and every direction looked the same, just endless dark trees and shadows. After what felt like hours, we stopped to catch our breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs shook from exhaustion. My dad leaned against a tree, his face pale and sweaty. The growling had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. "We need to keep moving," my dad said, his voice barely a whisper, but I didn't know where to go. We were lost in the Ozark forest, and that creature was still out there watching us. We wandered through the forest for what seemed like hours, trying to find our way back to the truck. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like the creature. My flashlight was starting to die, its beam growing weaker. The thought of being stuck in the forest in complete darkness terrified me. Just when I thought we would never find our way out, we stumbled upon a familiar path. It was narrow and overgrown, but I recognized it from earlier. My dad let out a sigh of relief, and we followed the path back to the truck. When we finally reached it, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands still shaking. My dad started the engine, and we drove away. The dark trees of the Ozark forest fading into the distance. We didn't speak on the ride home. The encounter with that creature was something neither of us could explain, and I didn't want to think about it anymore. But as I looked out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the forest that night. We made it out unharmed, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go hunting in those woods again. I've been a delivery driver for years, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night I took a turn into a neighborhood that seemed to pull me deeper into its darkness, refusing to let me go. I had been delivering food for a few months now, driving around San Antonio, Texas, and getting to know every corner of the city. Most nights were routine. Pick up the order, follow the GPS, drop it off, and move on to the next one. But that night was different. It was late, probably past midnight, and I had just received an order from a part of town I didn't recognize. The GPS led me away from the familiar roads and into a neighborhood I had never seen before. The houses were spaced far apart, and the streets seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Each corner I turned seemed to take me deeper into a maze of narrow roads and dark alleys. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, eerie shadows that made the entire area feel wrong. The further I drove, the more I felt like something was off. The roads didn't seem to match up with the map on my phone. I'd make a turn, and suddenly the GPS would tell me to turn back, as if the streets were changing while I drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. But I knew I had to deliver the order. That was the job. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the GPS announced that I had arrived. I slowed the car and looked at the house. It stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a tall, narrow building with peeling paint and broken windows. The lawn was overgrown, the grass reaching up to my knees, and there was no sign of life. It looked abandoned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to put the car in reverse and get out of there. But then I thought about the order. The customer waiting for their food. Maybe it was just an old house and someone still lived there. Maybe they were too busy or too tired to fix it up. I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a cold fog. I got out of the car, taking the bag of food with me. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating, as I walked toward the house. The gravel crunched under my feet, the only sound in the silent night. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled with the sensation, a chill running down my spine. When I reached the porch, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. It creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a dark hallway that stretched into the unknown. I could barely see a few feet inside, the darkness swallowing everything beyond that. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the echo of my voice bouncing back at me from the empty hall. Something deep inside me screamed to leave, to drop the food and run back to the car, but I took another step forward, peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. I turned to look back at the street, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from between the houses and around the corners. They moved silently, almost like they were gliding across the ground. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as they got closer. The first one stepped into the dim light of the porch, and I could see it. It was a person, but their face was hidden behind a blank white mask. The mask had no features, just smooth, cold porcelain. The others followed, all wearing the same eerie, expressionless masks. They surrounded me, their presence pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to back away, but I was trapped against the porch railing. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, my mind racing for a way out. One of them reached out, and I flinched, dropping the bag of food to the ground. Their hands were cold as ice as they grabbed me, pulling me toward the house. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were too strong. The more I fought, the tighter their grip became. They didn't say a word, didn't make a sound as they dragged me inside. The door slammed shut behind us, plunging me into darkness. I was blind, my other senses taking over. I could hear their footsteps around me, soft but purposeful. I could feel their cold hands on me, searching through my pockets, taking my wallet, my phone, and my keys. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the sound died in my throat. It was as if the darkness had swallowed my voice. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. All I could feel was the overwhelming dread, the terror that gripped me as they continued to strip me of everything I had. Finally, they let go of me, and I collapsed to the floor, trembling. I could hear their footsteps fading away, the creak of the door opening and closing again, and then they were gone, leaving me alone in the pitch-black house. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My mind replayed the events over and over, trying to understand, but there was no understanding. It was like I had stepped into another world, a place where the rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaking beneath me. I found the door, pushed it open, and stumbled out into the night. The street was empty. No sign of the masked figures, no sign of anyone. My car was still there, untouched, as if nothing had happened. I had been robbed, not just of my belongings, but of something more, my sense of safety, my trust in the world around me. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, the streets still twisting and turning, leading me in circles until I finally found my way out. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. I just kept driving, trying to escape the memory of those blank masks, of the cold hands that had pulled me into the darkness. But I knew no matter how far I drove, I would never truly escape. The fear would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to drag me back into that twisting, endless nightmare. I will never forget the day the police came knocking on our door. It had been months since she vanished, but the cold shiver down my spine still haunts me. I always knew there was something wrong with the house next door. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, you notice things. People in Maplewood kept to themselves, but everyone knew each other's business. Our street was quiet, lined with old houses and towering pine trees that whispered secrets in the wind. My family lived in a modest house with a white picket fence, but our neighbor's place was different. Bigger, newer, and always spotless. It looked out of place. The owner, Mr. Harris, was a wealthy man who lived there with his wife, Claire, and their 3-year-old daughter, Lily. Mr. Harris was an odd man. He rarely spoke to anyone and always kept to himself. What stood out the most was his obsession with his car. He owned a sleek black sports car, the kind you only see in movies. Every Saturday, without fail, he would be outside polishing and waxing it, as if it were his most prized possession. He would spend hours on that car, making sure every inch was perfect. I used to watch him from my window, wondering why a car could mean so much to someone. Claire, on the other hand, was the opposite of her husband. She was warm and friendly, always waving at me when she passed by, sometimes stopping to chat or offering cookies she had baked. Lily was a lively little girl, always laughing and playing in their yard. Seeing them together brought a touch of warmth to our otherwise quiet and uneventful neighborhood. But then, one day, everything changed. Claire and Lily disappeared. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I remember the day the police knocked on our door, asking if we had seen them. Mr. Harris had reported them missing, claiming his wife had left him and taken their daughter with her. My parents were shocked, but there wasn't much we could tell the police. We hadn't seen anything unusual, and like everyone else, we assumed Claire had left on her own. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of them. The whole town buzzed with rumors, each one wilder than the last. Some said Claire had run away with another man, while others whispered about something much darker. I tried to forget about it, but every time I saw Mr. Harris meticulously polishing his car, I felt a shiver down my spine. It seemed wrong, like he was trying to distract himself from something terrible. A few months after Claire and Lily had disappeared, something strange happened. My dad was in our garage, fixing his old pickup, when he noticed something in Mr. Harris's garage. The door was slightly open, and inside, barely visible, was Claire's white SUV, covered in dust, like it hadn't been touched in months. My dad called my mom and me over to see, and we all stood there, staring in shock. If Claire had run away, why was her car still here? A few days later, the SUV was gone. Mr. Harris had either sold it or done something with it. We never knew. He didn't say a word to us, but his behavior grew even stranger. He stopped going outside as much, and when he did, he seemed nervous, always glancing over his shoulder like he was being watched. The once pristine car now had a layer of dirt, and his perfectly kept yard began to look neglected. Then one night, I heard a loud crash coming from Mr. Harris's house. My parents and I were having dinner. My dad grabbed a flashlight and told us to stay inside as he went to check it out. From the window, I watched him cross the yard and knock on Mr. Harris's door. It took a long time for him to answer, and when he did, he looked pale, almost sick. My dad asked if everything was okay, but Mr. Harris just nodded and mumbled that he had dropped something. When my dad came back inside, he seemed unsettled. He told us he had seen something strange. When Mr. Harris opened the door, he noticed a pot of some liquid on the stove and a gun lying on the kitchen counter. Something about the scene deeply disturbed him. After that, Mr. Harris became even more reclusive. The whispers around town grew louder. Some believed he had done something terrible to his wife and daughter, but there was no proof, just suspicion and fear. I started having nightmares about what might have happened behind those closed doors. The idea that something awful could have taken place so close to home terrified me. Years have gone by since then. I've grown up, moved away, but sometimes I still think of Claire and Lily. I wonder what happened to them, where they are now, and if they ever found safety. I'll never forget the sight of that white SUV in the garage, the look on Mr. Harris's face when my dad knocked on his door. or the fear that gripped our town. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel that chill running down my spine, hoping wherever they are safe, far away from the man who loved his car a little too much. There's something about hospitals at night that feels off. It was on one of those quiet nights when I first met him, the man who seemed to have a morbid fascination with the dead. I work as an orderly at St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago. My shifts are long, usually dragging from late evening until the early morning hours. The hospital is an eerie place at night. Endless white walls, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional beep of a distant machine. The only real escape during those long hours is the basement office, a small, dimly lit room where I often pass the time when things are slow. That night was no different from any other. It was around 1 a.m., and I was in the basement with another orderly, Tom. We weren't doing much, just talking to pass the time, occasionally glancing at the clock, hoping our shift would end soon. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, the kind that clings to your clothes and fills your lungs. The only sounds were the faint buzzing of the overhead light and the low hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, we heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not like the rushed steps of a doctor or nurse. The sound caught both of our attention, and we turned to look at the open doorway. A man was walking by, his eyes darting toward us as he passed. There was something off about the way he looked at us, something shifty and unsettling. He didn't say anything, just kept walking, but I felt a chill creep up my spine. A few moments later, the man came back. This time he stopped at the doorway and looked directly at us. He had a pale, almost sickly complexion, and his eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were neat but outdated, like something out of an old movie. He didn't seem to belong in the sterile modern hospital. "Do you have access to the morgue?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I exchanged a glance with Tom. We both assumed he was there for a pickup for a funeral home. It wasn't entirely unusual, though the time of night made it strange. "Yes," I replied cautiously, wondering why he was asking so late. The man's expression didn't change, but there was a strange glint in his eyes that made me uneasy. I expected him to mention a name or give some sort of explanation, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us with that unsettling look. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "I'll pay you to let me in, just for an hour. I need to be alone with the bodies." His words hung in the air like a bad smell, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Tom and I exchanged another look, this one filled with disbelief and unease. The man didn't seem to notice our discomfort. His gaze was fixed, almost desperate, as if he were waiting for us to agree. I could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was asking. Who would want to be alone in the morgue at this time of night? And why? The whole situation felt wrong, like something out of a nightmare. "We can't do that," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "It's against hospital policy." The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue or try to persuade us further. But then he seemed to realize that we weren't going to budge. His eyes narrowed, and he clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face twitching slightly. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with a look that made my skin crawl. Finally, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Tom and I sat there in stunned silence, the gravity of what had just happened slowly sinking in. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something terrible. "We should tell security," I said after a few moments. Tom nodded, and we quickly made our way upstairs to the security office. The hospital felt even more ominous as we walked through the empty halls, the shadows seeming to stretch and grow in the dim light. When we reached the security office, we found the guard on duty and explained what had happened. As soon as we described the man, the guard's expression changed. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "Did he say anything about wanting to be alone in the morgue?" the guard asked, his voice tense. "Yes," I replied, the unease in my stomach deepening. The guard let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "He's tried this before. We've had a few run-ins with him over the past couple of months. He always disappears before we can catch him, but we know he's up to something." The man had done this before. What could he possibly want with the bodies in the morgue? My mind conjured up all sorts of disturbing possibilities, none of them comforting. The guard assured us that they would increase their patrols and keep an eye out for the man, but the whole experience left me shaken. As I made my way back to the basement office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had come dangerously close to something dark and twisted. The hospital didn't feel safe anymore, not that it ever really had, but now it was different. Now it felt like a place where shadows hid secrets too terrible to imagine. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his pale face, his desperate eyes, the way he had asked to be left alone with the dead. It all played over and over in my mind like a broken record. Even after my shift ended and I went home, the unease lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I walked past the morgue, I felt that same chill, the one that reminded me of how close we had come to letting something monstrous slip through our fingers. Sometimes you find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that night, it seemed like fate had led me right where I needed to be. It was late, way past midnight. I'd been working as a pizza delivery driver in Nashville, Tennessee, for almost a year, and most nights were the same. Busy streets, endless traffic, and impatient customers. But that night was different. The summer heat was oppressive, even after dark. My shirt clung to my back, and my mouth felt dry from hours without water. I was exhausted and just wanted to finish my last delivery and head home. I checked the address again as I pulled up to the house. The place was completely dark, with no lights on inside or outside. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were dirty, the paint was peeling, and the front lawn was overgrown with weeds. I parked my car and grabbed the pizza box, hoping this would be quick. But something about the house felt off. It felt abandoned, like a place forgotten by time, where shadows seem to move on their own. As I walked up to the front door, the silence was deafening. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I rang again, waiting, feeling the sweat drip down my neck. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the order. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered, out of breath and apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm on my way. Please just wait a few minutes." Her tone was nervous, like she was hiding something, or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I'll wait." But the urge to relieve myself was becoming unbearable. I glanced around, hoping to find some sign of life. A neighbor, maybe even a stray cat, anything that would make this place feel less eerie. But the street was empty. It was just me and this old, creepy house. I couldn't wait any longer. There was a large bush near the front of the house, thick with leaves. It was dark enough to give me some privacy, so I walked over, glancing around one last time before unzipping my pants. Relief washed over me as I let go, the tension in my body finally easing. But then I heard it, a rustling sound in the bushes right in front of me. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, almost falling over as I zipped up my pants. In the dim light, I saw a figure. Someone crouched low in the bush, their face hidden in shadows. I had just peed on a man. Before I could process what had just happened, the man suddenly bolted out of the bush, sprinting away. He didn't look back, just ran like his life depended on it, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who was he? What was he doing hiding in that bush? And why did he run? I looked down and saw something glinting in the faint light. A bag, half hidden in the leaves. I reached down, hands shaking, and pulled it out. It was a small, worn backpack, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a roll of duct tape, a knife with a serrated edge, and a length of rope. My breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary bag. This was something a person would carry if they had bad intentions. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This man, the one hiding in the bushes, wasn't just some vagrant or thief. He was planning something terrible, and I had interrupted him. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. I told them about the man, the bag, and the woman who was supposed to be coming to the house. They assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the distant wail of sirens. I paced the front yard, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting the man to return at any moment. Then I saw her, a woman walking quickly down the street, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. She was the one who had called, the customer. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and when she saw me, she broke into a run. "You have to help me," she said, her voice trembling as she reached me. "He's after me. My ex. He's dangerous." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward my car. "Get in," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was racing. "We'll wait for the police here." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she climbed into the passenger seat. I locked the doors, my eyes scanning the dark street, waiting for any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the flashing lights of police cars filled the street. Officers poured out, and I waved them over, explaining everything as quickly as I could. They moved swiftly, searching the area, but the man was long gone. The only thing left behind was the bag I had found. The woman was safe, and they took her statement, reassuring her that they would do everything they could to find her ex. I watched as she was led to one of the police cars, her face a mix of relief and lingering fear. As for me, I drove home that night, with the image of that man in the bushes burned into my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't been there, and if I hadn't needed to relieve myself at that exact moment. It wasn't just luck. Deep down, I knew I had been meant to be there, and the thought of how close that woman came to something terrible left me deeply shaken. I'll never forget that night, the way the shadows seemed to move, the oppressive heat pressing down on me, and the feeling of cold fear creeping up my spine.